it might well be an American cruise missile that's going through the window of the Kremlin. And I think America has demonstrated and Ukraine has demonstrated that they could do that. And the humiliation of attacks on key sites in Moscow, I think, would be enough to probably end Putin's reign. And I think that's the message getting across. Putin, you've got to come to the table and negotiate. Otherwise, we're going to finish you by attacking your key sites and strongholds in Moscow. And we can do it. And the world's seen that we can do it.
Also, according to the Washington Post, US President Trump and his team seriously considered the possibility of sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. This decision has not yet been made, but there are such discussions in the White House. Do you feel that Trump's team and Donald Trump, they are just rising, firstly, they're rising stakes in these negotiations with the Russian side, or do you see this as the last resort from the US team and the possibility of making the last threat to Putin to force him to sit at the negotiating table?
Yeah, I think this is very much the Americans turning up the pressure, turning the screw, tightening the screw, as we like. The cruise missiles, which again, we've seen how devastating they are. And some of these have ranges of thousands of miles and are precision, and also have demonstrated that they can evade Russian air defense systems. So I think it is turning up the pressure that, and perhaps the message that's getting into the Kremlin is, we are prepared to do anything. We are, the capabilities we have, the sophisticated weapons we have, which are a generation in advance of Russians. We are prepared to give them to Ukraine. So, you've got two options, really. You can keep and stay away from the peace negotiation table, or you can and accept what you would get from that, cruise missiles and everything else going on, or now is the time to negotiate a just peace. I think, as we've discussed before, my own view is that the Russian army is at its culminating point after losing 1 million casualties, 4,500 tanks. There's not a lot left. A lot of the recruits that Russians are throwing into the front line are very poorly trained. They've even had to buy 30,000 recruits off the North Koreans. Now, to me, that is a sign of desperation. That's not a sign of a modern, effective military fighting force. So, yeah, I think Trump and his team are turning up the pressure. And yesterday's announcement, by reducing the time Putin's got, is another bit. And it's a question of what they need to do to get Putin around the negotiation table, because I'm pretty sure they're going to follow through with some of these threats. I mean, the next 10 days are going to be pivotal, and it'll see how the Russians react. And of course, we've seen even over last night the massive attacks into Ukraine and the killing of nearly 30 people, we understand, in Ukraine. And this is after yesterday, President Trump said he was fed up and getting incredibly angry with the Kremlin, first on the one hand saying we're interested in peace, and then straight away going and killing Ukrainian civilians. So, if Putin was trying to put Trump off and perhaps, delay any further weaponry and sanctions, then I think actually he's probably going to achieve the exact opposite. And no doubt this will anger Trump immensely. And we haven't seen his reaction today, which no doubt we're going to see pretty soon, and his reaction to the rest of the week, because that 10 days now is sort of the end of next week, which is in this war and in these sort of stakes is not very long at all.
Also, in July 4th call with Zelensky, Trump said that Ukraine would not change the course of the war by playing defense and needed to go on the offensive, according to the Washington Post. Can you imagine a scenario in which Trump fully supports Ukraine's war effort, Ukraine's offensive, and provides Ukraine with offensive weaponry?
Well, I think again, this is clever wordage, if you like, coming out of Washington and the White House, really saying ultimately there is nothing the US and nothing NATO won't do to ensure that Ukraine gets a just peace. So again, this is building up the pressure. I don't think at this stage there is a suggestion that the US or NATO would put boots on the ground, as it were, British tanks and soldiers into Ukraine. It may well be there is talk that NATO air forces might be used to protect some of the civilian sites, some of the cities in Ukraine. But I think it's the rhetoric, ramping it up so that Putin knows that he has got no way out except to negotiate for peace. Because if the America followed through with its threats, then Putin would lose absolutely everything. And I think the Americans and Trump and his team are trying to say, this is the time for you to bail out Putin. If you keep going, you are going to be defeated. And ultimately, I suppose in a way that would be the best case for Ukraine. But whether the Americans would completely follow through, we'll have to wait and see. But I think there is in the last few weeks and the last few days, the pressure is really beginning to tighten, I would have thought, around Putin and his team in the Kremlin.
And do you believe that Tomahawk cruise missile could become a real game changer in this war if the US provides such missiles to Ukraine?
Well, I think no one single capability is going to be a game changer. It's a combination, and I think that is what is required. We've discussed many times before over the last 3 years how the West, the Americans and NATO have been too slow to produce capability for the Ukraine military. But ultimately now it appears that we are all on the same page, as it were. Long-range Tomahawk missiles are, very significant, and it's the sort of capability that we've seen have a strategic impact. But I think on their own, they're not going to win the war, but they are certainly part of it. And when you put in extra Patriot anti-aircraft missiles to protect the cities in Ukraine, when you make sure that Ukraine has enough ammunition and capability like Storm Shadow and Taurus and other missiles for the jets, then you get the feeling that Ukraine could do real damage into Russia. And you also understand that is the last thing that Putin wants. So I think cruise missile, maybe not a game changer, but it's a really, really strong decision that Trump can make, because ultimately, if we were talking 3 or 4 months ago and you asked me about cruise missiles, I'd say there wouldn't be a hope in hell, no chance that the Americans would give it to them. But things have very much changed, and let's hope this tightening of the screw will be enough for Putin to realize that, the game is up and the only way forward is peace.
Let's also cover our final question regarding this Trump's U-turn. Washington Post columnist David Ignatius reports and writes that Trump escalated against Putin for 3 reasons. He felt Putin was disrespecting him by ignoring his ceasefire request. Trump recognized the effectiveness of the US capabilities against Iran, and he believed that Putin would only negotiate under a threat of greater force. And Trump decided to escalate to de-escalate in Ukraine. Do you agree with this assessment from the Washington Post?
Yes, I think I do. I mean, it is a rather strange approach from President Putin, from President Trump. I think President Trump has suddenly realized that this is not a real estate deal he's involved in here. And he suddenly realized that President Putin, has no interest in peace. And President Putin has been making Trump look a bit of an idiot. And although President Trump is very thick-skinned, he likes to consider himself, one of the greatest people on the planet. But actually, he's been shown to be wanting in many, many areas. So I think this has caused the U-turn. I mean, Trump wants a great legacy in the same way that Putin wants a great legacy. But the only way Trump is going to get that legacy is by actually making peace around the world, which ultimately what the Americans should be doing with their hugely powerful military. Trump seems to have done a good thing in Iran by preventing their nuclear weapons capability developing, and has being effective. But ultimately, his biggest challenge, but also his biggest prize, would be bringing peace to Ukraine and Europe. And now I think he's worked out, or his advisors have worked out, what is the best way to deal with Putin. And as the rest of us know, that Putin exploits weakness but respects strength. And the more strength that President Trump can show, I think the more likely that Ukraine will get a just peace. And thank heavens, Trump has now realized this. And now, as the Washington Post says, is going, full on to try and get a peace deal as quickly as possible.
That also covers this big deal between the US and NATO to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons. US President Donald Trump have reached this deal with NATO allies, particularly with Germany, to provide Ukraine with 5 Patriot air defense systems. Germany is buying this, will buy this system in the US and will provide Ukraine with these systems to help Ukraine to defend its cities against Russian air threats. How can you assess this new approach from the US administration to help Ukraine to defend itself?
Well, I think it's very sensible, and actually, it's not really new. It's very similar to the U.S. Lend-lease program in the Second World War. When Britain and France were really struggling with weaponry, but actually were struggling with money, the Americans sort of lent them a whole bunch of tanks and aircraft, which in effect the Brits and the French leased off the Americans and ultimately paid back. In a similar vein now, I think what Trump the deal he's done, he's not giving weapons to Ukraine, but he is making sure that European countries like France and Germany and Britain buy these sophisticated American weapons which Ukraine needs and then give them to them. So, it strikes me as a sensible way of doing business. Hopefully it's a win-win for everybody. Ukraine gets the weapons it needs to be able to protect the country. European NATO countries do what they've always said they're going to do and try and protect Europe and protect Ukraine. And, the American people don't fit this huge bill of weaponry, which it was becoming unpopular. So I think it's a pretty smart move. And ultimately, we shall just have to see if it's successful. But I personally believe that it is, with everything else that's going on at the moment, this should be enough to bring the Russians to the negotiation table, because I think the Russians know now that if they don't negotiate, in the next 10 days or so, they could well lose everything that they think they've gained, which, for some of us, that wouldn't be a bad thing. But, we need to practice realpolitik, as it were. We need to make sure that Ukraine gets absolutely the best deal it can as soon as possible, rather than holding out for something that might never happen.
Although US President Trump is reducing this deadline for the Russian side to agree with ceasefire deal, seems like Vladimir Putin doesn't care about US threats, because according to the latest article posted by Reuters, Putin intends to keep fighting in Ukraine until the West engages on his terms for peace, and his territorial demands may widen as Russian forces advance. 3 sources close to the Kremlin told Reuters. Also, Putin believes that Russia's economy and his military are strong enough to weather any additional Western sanctions. What is your reaction to this, and can Russia really survive another sanctions packages from the US administration?
Well, I think this is classic Russian disinformation and propaganda. And well, it's not surprising at all. I think, we could have almost written the Russian press releases ourselves because, of course, they want to try and show that they are not in desperate straits and they can keep going. But, still having a powerful Russian military, everybody knows that's not the case. And when you look at what NATO has arrayed in Europe, vastly overmatches anything the Russian had or has at the moment. So I don't think anybody's been fooled there. And also, it's well known the Russian economy, even the Russian banks are talking about a devastated economy. So I think it's not expected. The Russians, of course, are trying to talk up the situation because they know they're going to have to negotiate soon. And as Trump is doing, trying to get into the best possible position to be able to negotiate the best peace deal, the Russians are trying to do the same. So I think it's unsurprising, but I think what is important that everybody understands exactly what the situation is, and the Russian army is not in a great position. The Russian economy is not in a great position. And at last, people in Russia are beginning to realize exactly that. So, yeah, I think this is the normal noise that we hear out of the Kremlin, on a daily basis. But hopefully the correct description of what's happening in Russia is the ones that people will listen to in the West, and the ones which will be very influential when it comes to hopefully negotiating a peace, once Trump flexes his military muscles and his financial muscles in the next 10 days or so.
Let's cover also our final topic, NATO's nuclear deterrence. The US has likely stationed nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom for the first time since 2008, in a signal to Vladimir Putin that the US remains committed to NATO's security, according to Bloomberg. What is your reaction to this development?
I think this is another really important move. We've discussed before that my view is there's been a slight imbalance in the nuclear capabilities, as it were, because NATO, well, the European NATO countries, the nuclear capability, Britain and France, do not necessarily have the amount of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons which the Russians have. And we know that the Russians have threatened attack all the time. I think it sends a really strong message that, first of all, Britain is prepared to have American nuclear weapons on our soil. And secondly, that America is prepared to put them there, because that means that, any aggression, any nuclear aggression by the Russians can be very quickly dealt with by American tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, Britain has announced that it is buying the F-35A stealth fighter jet, so that Britain can have a tactical nuclear capability. So again, very strong messages coming out. And, I don't think this is accidental or coincidental. No doubt all these decisions have been planned to ramp up the pressure. And no doubt there'll be a few more as the 10 days that Putin has left to make a decision rapidly declines.
It seems also we have another U-turn related to the NATO's security. The US has not withdrawn any kind of American troops from Europe, despite such discussions happened in the White House. How do you see the main reasons behind this another U-turn in US commitment to NATO?
Well, I think certainly since when President Trump and his team took power in January of this year, there's a very different situation. The original cry of US isolation, moving all military capability back into mainland US, that's very much changed, and one anticipated that the Americans were going to withdraw a lot of their manpower and military capability from Europe, which they're actually not doing. I expect this is more the new American administration working out how is the best way to do these things? And I think a lot of us have always said that it's much better to defend forward, defend where way beyond your own borders. And perhaps naively, the American administration thought they could just defend the American mainland. They've now realized that actually they can't, or that would not be an effective way of doing it. And they still need a strong force in Europe to defend against the Russians. They need strong forces in the Middle East to defend against the Iranians. And in the Pacific, where a lot of activity is going on at the moment, the Americans are concerned about what the Chinese are up to. So I think it's a realization that their original stance was just not working. And the upping of the pressure on Putin is really welcomed and is the most likely way that we're going to see Putin round a negotiation table, hopefully sometime soon.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.